The old Hollow Creek Cemetery had always been a place of whispered tales and uneasy glances. Nestled deep in the woods of Pennsylvania, the graveyard had stood for over 200 years, its tombstones weathered by time and the elements. It was said that some of the town's earliest settlers had been buried there, along with drifters, criminals, and those who had simply disappeared from history. For as long as anyone could remember, strange occurrences plagued the cemetery. The local teenagers dared each other to step inside its rusting wrought iron gates at night, but none ever lingered long. Stories of shadows shifting between graves, distant whispers carried on the wind, and the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the dark were enough to keep most people far away. But to Jacob Turner, it was just another place on his urban exploration checklist. A YouTuber known for investigating haunted locations, Jacob had made a name for himself by debunking ghost stories or proving them real. He and his best friend, Mark, had spent the past few years traveling across America, documenting eerie places and testing the limits of their courage. On a crisp October evening, Jacob and Mark arrived at Hollow Creek Cemetery, armed with night vision cameras, EVP recorders, and flashlights. The sky was overcast, the thick clouds blotting out the moon, leaving only the dim glow of their headlights to illuminate the path leading up to the cemetery gates. "This place gives me a bad feeling," Mark muttered as he adjusted his camera. "That's the point," Jacob grinned, pushing open the heavy iron gate with a loud protesting creak. "The best stories come from places like this." They stepped inside, the crunch of dead leaves beneath their boots breaking the otherwise eerie silence. The graveyard stretched far beyond what their flashlights could reach, headstones jutting out at odd angles like broken teeth. Some were so old that the names had been worn away, leaving only crumbling slabs of stone. Jacob turned on his night vision camera. "All right, guys, we're officially inside Hollow Creek Cemetery. Legend has it that those who stay past midnight experience strange things." Mark let out a nervous chuckle. "Yeah, like disappearing altogether." Jacob rolled his eyes. "We'll be fine." They wandered deeper, stopping to examine graves and record EVPs. The first hour was uneventful, just the usual creaks of tree branches and rustling of leaves. But as midnight approached, the air seemed to change. A bitter cold settled over them, far too frigid for an October night. Their breath curled in the air and an unsettling quiet took hold. Jacob frowned. "Do you hear that?" Mark shook his head. "Hear what?" Jacob swallowed. "Nothing. That's the problem. No wind, no insects, just nothing." Then from the darkness came a whisper. Both men froze. It had been faint, almost like a breath carried on the wind, but unmistakable. Jacob turned in the direction of the sound, his heart pounding. "Hello?" Silence. Mark exhaled sharply. "Okay, that's creepy. Maybe the mic picked it up." Jacob checked the audio recorder, but there was nothing unusual, just their own voices and the ambient silence. And then, a child's laughter. Both of them whirled around. It had come from just behind them, near a cluster of graves. The sound was soft, playful, but horribly out of place. Mark took a step back. "Dude, there's no way." Jacob gritted his teeth. "Someone's messing with us." He lifted his flashlight, scanning the area. The beam landed on something that made his blood run cold, a tiny gravestone, barely visible through the overgrown weeds. It was a child's grave. A gust of wind suddenly swept through the cemetery, rustling the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and something sickly sweet like rotting flowers. Jacob's flashlight flickered. "Time to go," Mark said quickly, turning toward the gate. But then the laughter came again. "Closer." Jacob spun around and his flashlight caught movement. A figure stood several feet away, half hidden behind a large tombstone. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, in a tattered white dress. Her hair hung in loose curls, obscuring part of her face, but what Jacob could see made his stomach drop. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes black. Completely black. "Jacob," Mark whispered, "we have to go, now." The girl tilted her head. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "Stay." Jacob's entire body locked up. The word seemed to echo in his mind, an unnatural compulsion pressing against his will. His limbs felt heavy, his breath shallow. Mark grabbed his arm and yanked him backward. "Move." Jacob stumbled, breaking the trance, and together they sprinted toward the gate. The cemetery felt alive around them. Shadows shifted unnaturally. Cold fingers of mist curled around their ankles. The laughter twisted, growing distorted like a radio tuning between channels. The gate was only a few feet away when something grabbed Jacob's wrist. An icy grip, small but impossibly strong. He turned, and the girl was Right there, her face inches from his. Stay, she whispered again. Jacob let out a strangled yell, wrenching his arm free and barreling through the gate. Mark slammed it shut behind them, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight lifted. Gasping, they stumbled toward their car. Jacob's hands were shaking as he fumbled for the keys. When they finally sped away, neither of them spoke, too consumed by what had just happened. Only later, after they had driven miles away, did Jacob dare to check his camera. The footage was mostly normal until the last 5 minutes. The moment they heard the whisper, the video turned distorted, flickering with static. And then, just before they ran, a single frame, a still image of the little girl, standing just behind them. Jacob dropped the camera with a curse, his stomach twisting. His wrist still felt cold where she had touched him. The next morning, he examined the area where she had grabbed him. Faint, bruised fingerprints marred his skin. He never posted the footage. He never went back. And he never stopped feeling like someone was watching him.
Story number 2.
The town of Ashford had always been small, tucked away in the forests of Maine, where the trees grew tall enough to block out the sun. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, where old traditions never quite faded, and where some things best left undisturbed, were whispered about but never truly spoken of. One of those things was Blackwood Cemetery. It sat on the outskirts of town, buried deep in the woods, forgotten by time. No one knew exactly how old it was, only that it had been there before the town itself. The graves were crooked and crumbling, their inscriptions worn down to nothing but ghostly indentations. Some said the dead buried there had been cursed. Others said the land itself was wrong, that the soil was tainted with something ancient and hungry. Nobody went there anymore. Nobody except Ethan Bellamy. Ethan had always been a skeptic. He had spent years debunking ghost stories, writing articles about superstition and fear. He didn't believe in curses, hauntings, or anything beyond what could be explained by science. So when he heard about Blackwood Cemetery, he wasn't scared. He was intrigued. I'll prove it's just another abandoned graveyard, he told his friend Mason as they stood outside Ethan's truck, parked at the edge of the woods. Mason shifted uneasily. Man, I don't know. My grandpa used to say people who went there didn't come back the same. Ethan smirked. And your grandpa also believed in witches. Mason didn't argue. He just exhaled sharply and slung his backpack over his shoulder. Fine. But if anything weird happens, we're out. The two of them stepped into the forest, the sound of crunching leaves filling the air. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The birds stopped singing. The wind stopped blowing. Even their footsteps seemed muted, like as if the trees themselves were swallowing the sound. Then, after nearly an hour of walking, they saw it. The entrance was barely visible through the tangle of branches and vines. A rusted iron gate stood half open, its hinges fused with age. Beyond it, the cemetery stretched in eerie silence, gravestones peeking out like broken bones from the earth. Ethan pulled out his flashlight. Let's take a look. Mason hesitated. I don't like this. Ethan rolled his eyes. It's just a bunch of old graves, man. But as soon as he stepped past the gate, the air changed. The temperature dropped so fast that his breath turned to mist. The smell of wet earth and decay filled his nostrils. Mason crossed his arms. Get your pictures and let's go. Ethan started snapping photos, moving deeper into the graveyard. Some of the graves were open, not collapsed from age, but gaping as if something had crawled out. He shivered, but forced himself to keep moving. Then in the silence, he heard it. A whisper. Low. Breathless. Right behind him. He spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. Just Mason standing a few feet away, looking just as unsettled. You heard that right? Ethan asked. Mason nodded slowly. Yeah, I heard it. A breeze suddenly rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of more whispers, too many voices to count. They wove together, overlapping, surrounding them. Go back. Not yours. Leave. Ethan's stomach twisted. He raised his flashlight, sweeping it across the graves. The beam landed on something that made his blood turn to ice. A figure stood at the far end of the cemetery. It was tall, too tall, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed to twitch at an unnatural angle. Its skin was the color of dead wood, dry and cracked like bark. It had no eyes, just hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the light. Then it moved. Not like a person. Not like anything Ethan had ever seen. It shifted as if the space around it warped with every step. Mason grabbed Ethan's arm. We need to go. The whispers grew louder, turning into a chorus of wails, like dozens of voices screaming from beneath the earth. The air vibrated with something Ethan couldn't explain. Something wrong. He ran. They bolted toward the entrance, dodging broken gravestones, branches clawing at their clothes. Ethan dared a glance back. The thing was closer. It wasn't running. It was just there, its limbs jerking in impossible directions. The ground beneath them shuddered. Mason let out a strangled cry as his foot plunged through the soil. Ethan turned just in time to see something gripping his ankle from inside a grave. A hand, rotting and gnarled, its fingers wrapped around Mason's leg. Mason screamed, kicking at it desperately, but more hands erupted from the ground, clawing their way toward them. Ethan grabbed Mason's arms and pulled. He could feel the strength of whatever was down there, pulling back. Mason's face twisted in terror. Ethan, don't let go! Don't let go! With one final yank, Mason broke free. They stumbled backward, barely keeping their balance. The hands slithered back into the earth, but the whispers remained. They reached the rusted gate, practically diving through it. The moment their feet hit the other side, the air shifted. The whispers stopped. Silence. Ethan turned back. The graveyard was empty. The figure was gone. The hands were gone. But something was wrong. Mason was staring at him, his eyes wide. Ethan, your arm. Ethan looked down. Fingernail marks. Deep, bloody, not from Mason, from whatever had been holding him. They didn't stop running until they reached the truck. For weeks, neither of them spoke about what happened. Ethan tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just an illusion, his mind playing tricks. But deep down, he knew better, because the whispers didn't stop. They followed him home. Late at night, in the silence of his apartment, he would hear them. Soft, hushed, just beyond the edge of hearing. Then, one night, he woke up gasping for breath, his chest heavy, as if something was sitting on top of him. He opened his eyes and saw it, the figure from the cemetery, standing at the foot of his bed. Its head twitched. It whispered, "Not yours? Leave." The next morning, Ethan packed his things and left Ashford. He never spoke of Blackwood Cemetery again. But sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the whispers. And sometimes when he walked past dark alleys or empty rooms, he felt something watching, waiting, hungry.
Story number 3.
The town of Willow Creek was quiet, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and everyone knew each other's names. But there was one place that even the bravest locals avoided: the old St. Mercy Cemetery. It sat on the outskirts of town, abandoned and overgrown, the headstones cracked and sinking into the earth like decayed teeth. No one tended to it, no flowers were left on graves, and no funerals had been held there in decades. The church that once stood beside it had burned down in the early 1900s, leaving nothing but blackened stone and the remnants of a foundation. But the most unsettling thing about St. Mercy Cemetery was the bell tower grave. It wasn't really a grave, at least not officially. At the very center of the cemetery stood a stone tower, roughly 10 feet high, with a rusted iron bell at the top. No one knew who built it or why. The only entrance was a sealed iron door, fused shut by time and rust. The townspeople had tried to tear it down once, but every attempt ended in accidents. Workers went missing, tools broke mysteriously, and eventually they stopped trying. The stories about the bell tower grave varied. Some claimed it was built to trap something inside. Others said that if you knocked on the door 3 times at midnight, the bell would ring on its own, and whoever heard it wouldn't live to see the morning. No one had tested the legend in years, until Brandon Carter. Brandon was new to Willow Creek, a college student staying with his aunt while taking a break from school. He had always been fascinated by ghost stories, but he didn't believe in them. So when he overheard some locals talking about St. Mercy Cemetery at a diner one evening, he decided to check it out for himself. "You're seriously going there?" his cousin Jake asked, his face pale. Brandon shrugged. "Why not? It's just a bunch of old graves." Jake shook his head. "No, it's not. People don't go there for a reason." "Because of a bell?" Brandon scoffed. "Come on, man, it's just superstition." Jake hesitated. "Look, just don't mess with the tower. If you hear anything weird, leave." Brandon laughed, but he could tell Jake was serious. Still, fear had never stopped him before. That night, armed with a flashlight and his phone for recording, Brandon made his way to St. Mercy Cemetery. The air was thick with fog, the trees looming like skeletal fingers against the moonlight. The gate to the cemetery was missing, its wooden posts rotted away long ago. He stepped inside. The silence was immediate and absolute. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just stillness. The graves stretched before him in uneven rows, some leaning, others half buried. The wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and something sour, like rotting wood. Then he saw it. The bell tower grave stood at the heart of the cemetery, just as the stories described. The tower was old, covered in thick ivy, the iron bell barely visible through the vines. The door at the base was solid metal, rusted shut. Brandon smirked and pulled out his phone, recording as he walked up to it. "All right, guys," he whispered into the camera. "Here it is. The so-called haunted bell tower. Let's see if this thing really rings." He lifted his hand and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed, dull against the metal. Nothing happened. Brandon grinned. "See? Just a dong." The bell rang. His breath caught in his throat. His first thought was that it had been the wind. But there was no wind. The air was dead still. Then, from somewhere inside the tower, he heard it. Scraping, like nails dragging against stone. Tinette. Brandon's mouth went dry. He stepped back, his flashlight trembling, his mind raced. There was no way something could be inside. The tower had been sealed shut for decades. Then came the whisper, low, hissing, right next to his ear. "Let me out." Brandon spun, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Nothing, just empty graves and shifting shadows. His pulse pounded. This wasn't funny anymore. He turned and bolted for the exit. His feet pounded against the soft ground, his breath coming in short gasps. He was almost to the tree line when he heard it. Footsteps. Not his own. Heavy, dragging footsteps following too close behind. He didn't dare look back. He reached the edge of the cemetery and ran straight to his truck, his hands fumbling with the keys. He jumped in, locked the doors, and jammed the key into the ignition. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the road ahead. Something moved. A shadow. Tall. Wrong. Like standing at the cemetery's entrance, just beyond the tree line. Brandon's breath caught. His fingers gripped the wheel, heart hammering. The figure didn't move. It stood there, head tilted, its limbs too long, too thin. Its face was obscured by shadow, but he could feel it watching him. He slammed the truck into reverse, tires skidding as he tore down the road. He didn't stop driving until he was back home. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the bell ringing. Dong! Over and over. The next morning, he checked his phone. The footage from the cemetery was still there. He hit play, his hands clammy. The video was grainy in the darkness, the bell tower looming in the center of the frame. He watched himself knock, watched himself react when the bell rang. But then, the camera glitched. The screen warped for a split second. And in that brief moment, just before he turned to run, a face appeared in the screen, pressed against the lens. Pale, hollow-eyed, mouth stretched in a silent scream. Brandon threw the phone across the room. His chest heaved. The footage wasn't possible because whatever had been in the video had been standing right behind him. That night, he locked his bedroom door, kept the lights on, and forced himself to stay awake. But at some point, exhaustion won. He didn't know what time it was when he woke up, but he knew what woke him. Dong, the bell, louder, closer. His breath hitched. Then he heard the whisper, "Let me out." This time it wasn't outside, it was inside the room, right next to his bed.
Story number 4.
The town of Cold Hollow had always been a quiet place, nestled deep in the forests of Vermont. A town where time seemed to stand still, where people lived and died without much fuss. But there was one part of Cold Hollow that people refused to speak about, a place that existed just beyond the edge of town. It wasn't large, just a small fenced-off graveyard hidden in the woods, its tombstones sinking into the soft earth. No one had been buried there in over a century, and yet it never felt empty. The stories about Black Ridge varied. Some said it was built over an old Native American burial ground. Others claimed that the dead buried there weren't regular townsfolk, but something else, something that wasn't meant to rest. People who wandered too close at night spoke of strange whispers, of feeling something watching from the trees. No one had dared go there in decades, until Ben Harper. Ben was a city boy, visiting Cold Hollow to help his grandmother move into a retirement home. He didn't believe in ghost stories, and he certainly didn't believe in cursed cemeteries. So, when he overheard some of the locals at the gas station talking about Black Ridge, he saw it as nothing more than an opportunity. I'm going to check it out, he told his friend Eric later that evening. Eric, who had lived in Cold Hollow his entire life, did not like that idea. Dude, no. People don't go there, not unless they're stupid or want to end up missing. Ben scoffed. Come on, man, it's just an old cemetery. Eric's expression darkened. My uncle went there once. He came back, wrong, he never talked about what happened, but after that night, he couldn't sleep. Kept locking his doors. One night, Eric hesitated. He just left, walked into the woods. No one ever saw him again. Ben shook his head, laughing. You seriously believe that? Eric didn't laugh. Just promise me you won't go. Ben didn't promise. That night, armed with a flashlight and his phone, Ben made his way to Black Ridge Cemetery. It wasn't hard to find. A narrow dirt road led him to a rusted iron gate, slightly ajar. The sign above it was barely legible, worn down by time. Beyond the gate, the cemetery stretched out in eerie silence. The graves were old, the names barely visible on their cracked surfaces. A few had sunken deep into the earth, as if something had dragged them down. Ben pulled out his phone, recording as he stepped inside. All right, guys, he whispered to the camera. Here we are at the legendary Black Ridge Cemetery. Let's see if this place is really haunted. As soon as he stepped past the gate, the temperature dropped. The air felt thick, pressing against his skin. The trees swayed, though there was no wind. The graveyard stretched out before him in unnatural silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of the town. Just nothing. Ben swallowed, pushing forward. He moved carefully between the tombstones, scanning the area with his flashlight. Most of the graves were nameless, their inscriptions long faded. He passed one that had a gaping hole where the earth had collapsed. He frowned. That's weird. Then a whisper. Soft. Just behind him. Ben froze. Hello? No answer. He turned slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing was there. He let out a shaky breath, probably just his mind playing tricks. He'd spooked himself, that's all. But then something moved. Not in front of him, not to the side, behind one of the gravestones. Ben's grip on the flashlight tightened. He stepped closer, heart hammering. The tombstone was tall, wide enough to conceal someone behind it. He raised his phone, recording. All right, guys, I think we've got. The whisper came again, right next to his ear. Leave. His feet pounded against the ground, breath ragged. He sprinted toward the gate, barely keeping himself from tripping over the uneven earth. His flashlight flickered, the shadows around him twisting unnaturally. Then, the gate was gone. Ben skidded to a stop. The entrance he had walked through just minutes ago was gone, replaced by more graves, stretching endlessly into the darkness. His stomach lurched. That wasn't possible. He turned in circles, breath quickening. The tombstones seemed closer now, pressing in from all sides. The air hummed, the silence thick with something unseen. Then he saw it. A figure stood among the graves, far away at first. Then closer. Not moving, not walking. Just there. Its form was wrong. Tall, thin, its limbs too long, fingers curled like claws. Its face was blurred, shifting like a smudged photograph. Ben's legs refused to move. His body felt frozen, his mind screaming at him to run. Then it spoke. You shouldn't be here. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was everywhere, pressing into his skull. Ben finally found his legs. He bolted, sprinting blindly through the dark. The graves blurred past him, the trees seeming to move as if shifting out of place. Then the gate appeared. Ben didn't stop. He barreled through it, nearly collapsing onto the dirt road outside. The moment his feet hit the ground, the sounds returned, the wind, the crickets, the rustling trees. He turned back. The cemetery was silent. The figure was gone. His chest heaved, heart slamming against his ribs. His hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, checking the recording. The footage was normal until the last minute. The video glitched, flickering wildly. For a split second, a face appeared on the screen. Hollow eyes, mouth open in a silent scream. Ben deleted the footage. He never spoke of what happened, never went near Black Ridge again. But sometimes late at night he would wake to whispers, soft, just outside his window. And when he looked outside, past the trees and into the darkness, he would see the figure, watching, waiting, and the cemetery would whisper his name, calling him back.
Story number 5.
The town of Ravenshade had its fair share of ghost stories, but none were as feared as the legend of Hollow Pine Cemetery. It sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, a place forgotten by time. No one tended to the graves, no records existed of who was buried there, and those who had tried to document it over the years either vanished or returned, changed. The town's elders refused to speak of it. Hunters who wandered too close claimed the air itself hummed as if something unseen lurked beneath the soil. The trees that surrounded the cemetery were gnarled and twisted, growing away from it, as if they too were trying to escape. No one went to Hollow Pines. Until Cameron Wells. Cameron was a thrill-seeker, a ghost hunter who had spent years traveling the country, documenting haunted places, and proving that most of them were nothing more than superstition. He had explored abandoned asylums, walked through houses that were supposedly cursed, and had never once encountered anything that couldn't be explained. So, when he heard about Hollow Pines, he didn't hesitate. His friend Liam, a local who had agreed to guide him, wasn't as eager. "You sure about this, man?" Liam asked as they drove down the dirt path toward the woods. Cameron smirked. "What's the worst that could happen? Ghosts aren't real." Liam shook his head. "You don't get it. People who go there, they come back wrong, if they come back at all." Cameron rolled his eyes. "It's just another graveyard. Nothing but old stones and some spooky trees." Liam didn't argue. He just gripped the wheel a little tighter as they reached the edge of the forest. The walk was longer than Cameron expected. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of their boots against the dead, brittle ground. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing against them. Then, after nearly an hour of walking, they saw it. The cemetery. It was small, no more than 50 graves, but something about it felt off. The tombstones were crooked, some cracked in half, others missing entirely. The ground looked disturbed, like something had been digging. Cameron lifted his camera, recording. "All right, guys, here we are. Hollow Pines Cemetery, the most haunted place in Ravenshade. Let's see if it lives up to the legend." Liam stayed by the tree line, arms crossed. Cameron moved forward, stepping between the graves. The air felt colder here, though there was no wind. His breath misted in front of him. Then, a whisper. Low. Too close. Cameron spun around, but Liam was still at the edge of the cemetery, his face pale. "You hear that?" Cameron called. Liam nodded. "We should go." Cameron ignored him, moving deeper into the cemetery. He passed an old rusted gate that led to a section of the graveyard where the stones were even more weathered. Some of them were blank, as if time had erased the names. Then he saw it. A grave that was open. The dirt around it was freshly disturbed. Cameron frowned. Someone's been digging here. Liam's voice came from behind him, but it sounded wrong. That grave was always open. Cameron turned. Liam was still by the tree line. He hadn't spoken. Cameron's breath hitched. The voice had come from right next to him. His flashlight flickered. The air grew even colder. He felt a presence, something standing just outside his vision. Then, from inside the open grave, a sound. Not an animal, not the wind, a slow, wet scraping. Cameron stepped closer, his hands trembling. He shined his light into the hole, and something looked back at him. A face, but not a human one. It was stretched. Pale, its mouth too wide, filled with rows of teeth too sharp for any person. Its hollow black eyes stared up at him, unblinking. Then it smiled. Cameron stumbled backward, heart slamming against his ribs. The thing in the grave moved, its long, bony fingers clawing at the edges of the dirt, pulling itself up. Liam's voice, his real voice, shouted from behind him. "Run!" Cameron didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted, nearly tripping over the tombstones. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming words he couldn't understand. The ground beneath him felt wrong, like it wasn't solid anymore, like something beneath the surface was moving. Liam was already running, crashing through the trees. Cameron followed, his lungs burning, his ears ringing with the sound of something chasing him. Not footsteps, something dragging itself through the dirt. Too fast, too unnatural. He didn't look back. They reached the truck, practically throwing themselves inside. Liam turned the key, the engine roared to life, and they tore out of the woods, tires spitting dirt and leaves into the night. Neither of them spoke. Not until they reached town, parked under the glow of a street lamp. Cameron's hands still shook. He turned to Liam. "What the hell was that?" Liam exhaled sharply. "Now, do you believe me?" Cameron didn't answer. He checked his camera, his fingers unsteady. The footage was there. It showed the graves, the tombstones, the open grave. But then, as the camera panned over the hole, static. Just for a second. And in that brief moment, the screen showed something, a face pressed against the lens, that smiling thing. But the worst part? When Cameron had been running, when he had recorded the cemetery behind him, there had been dozens of them, standing in the darkness, their grinning faces watching him go. Cameron deleted the footage. He left Ravenshade the next morning. But some nights when the world was silent, he still heard the whispers. And sometimes when he passed a cemetery, he saw those same smiling faces, waiting, watching, calling him back.
Story number 6.
The town of Elders Hollow had a secret. It was a quiet town, tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the roads twisted like veins through the dense forest. A town where people kept their heads down, locked their doors at night, and never spoke about the Burton Cemetery. It wasn't marked on any map. If you asked about it, people would look away, their faces turning pale. Some would mutter a prayer under their breath. Others would simply whisper, "Don't go up there." But no one ever explained why. That was exactly the kind of mystery that fascinated Rachel Carter. Rachel was an investigative journalist who specialized in forgotten history. If a place had been erased from records, if there were rumors that people were too afraid to speak about, she made it her mission to uncover the truth. So when she came across an old yellowed article about Burton Cemetery, she knew she had to go. The article was vague, just a brief mention of a mass burial in the 1800s, miners who had been trapped in a cave-in. But what caught her attention was the last line of the report. They buried them, but they never stayed buried. Rachel was determined to find out what that meant. She rented a cabin near the outskirts of Elders Hollow and spent the first few days trying to get information from the locals. No one wanted to talk. The old woman who ran the general store simply shook her head and muttered, "The dead should be left alone." The bartender at the only tavern in town told her, "If you know what's good for you, you'll leave it alone." Even the librarian refused to help, her hands shaking as she whispered, "Some places aren't meant to be found." Rachel didn't listen. She found an old, hand-drawn map tucked away in a dusty library book, one that showed the location of Burton Cemetery, hidden deep in the forest. That night, armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and her camera, Rachel set off. The path was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and twisted roots. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of her own breathing. Then she found it. A rusted iron gate stood before her, bent and broken. Beyond it, the cemetery stretched into the darkness. Rachel stepped inside. The graves were wrong. Most of the tombstones were cracked or missing entirely. The ground was uneven, as if something beneath the soil had shifted. Some graves looked disturbed, the dirt freshly turned. She raised her camera, taking photos. That's when she heard it. A whisper. Soft. Just behind her. Rachel froze. Slowly she turned. Nothing. Just graves and the skeletal remains of trees. She exhaled sharply, just her mind playing tricks on her. She moved deeper into the cemetery, scanning the names on the gravestones. Many were unreadable, eroded by time, but one caught her eye. Samuel Grayson, died 1847. Beneath it, someone had carved words into the stone. The letters were uneven, shaky, as if written in desperation. "He won't stay down." Rachel frowned. She snapped a photo. Then the whisper came again. Closer. A chill ran up her spine. Her flashlight flickered. The air turned thick, pressing against her skin. Then, from the corner of her eye, something moved. Rachel whipped around, heart hammering. One of the graves, it was open. The dirt around it was disturbed, fresh. Her breath caught. Then something shifted inside the grave. A hand. No, not a hand. Something else. Long fingers, too thin, too sharp, clawing at the earth. Rachel took a step back, her breath ragged. Then the whisper became a moan, low, hollow, rising from beneath the ground. She turned to run, but something grabbed her ankle. She screamed, kicking wildly. The grip was cold, fingers tightening. With one last desperate kick, she tore free, stumbling backward. That's when she saw them. Not just one, dozens. Figures crawling out of the graves, their bodies twisted, their faces wrong, their mouths hung open, but no voices came, just whispers overlapping, surrounding her. Rachel ran. The trees blurred past her, her lungs burning. The whispers chased her, growing louder, forming words. "You shouldn't be here." She didn't stop, didn't look back. When she finally reached the rusted gate, she threw herself through it, crashing onto the dirt path outside. The second she hit the ground, silence. The whispers stopped. Rachel lay there, gasping. Slowly she turned her head. The cemetery was empty. No figures, no movement. just stillness. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She scrambled to her feet, running all the way back to her cabin. That night, she locked the doors, shoved furniture against them, and curled up in bed, shaking. She didn't sleep. When the sun finally rose, she grabbed her camera, determined to prove to herself that it wasn't just her imagination. The photos were clear: the cemetery, the disturbed graves. But the last photo, the one she had taken of Samuel Grayson's tombstone, it had changed. The words scratched into the stone were different now. No longer, "He won't stay down." Instead, it said, "Neither will you." Rachel left Elder's Hollow that morning. She never spoke of what happened, never wrote about it, never looked back. But some nights, when the world was silent, she still heard the whispers, soft, just outside her window, calling her back.
Story number 7.
It started with a dare. Dawson Creek Cemetery had always been the subject of stories. Tucked deep within the Louisiana bayou, it was said to be one of the oldest burial sites in the state. Most of the graves dated back to the early 1800s, their names eroded by time and moss. But no one in town spoke about the 7 unmarked graves at the center of the cemetery. They weren't just forgotten, they had been erased. The legend said that those graves belonged to a group of people who had been executed for something unspeakable. Some claimed they were witches, others said they were murderers. But everyone agreed on one thing: you never stepped on their graves. If you did, you wouldn't leave the cemetery alive. It was just a story, a silly tale to scare kids. At least that's what Chris, Mark, and Jess told themselves when they snuck into the cemetery that night. They were 17, bored, and looking for a thrill. Mark was the one who suggested it, grinning as he said, "Whoever steps on the graves and stays there the longest wins." Jess hesitated. "I don't know, man. My grandma used to talk about this place. She said people who messed with those graves disappeared." Chris laughed. "Yeah? And did she also tell you about the boogeyman under your bed?" Jess frowned. But Mark was already climbing over the rusted fence, so she sighed and followed. The cemetery was silent. The air smelled of wet earth and decay. Their flashlights cast long shadows across the crumbling headstones as they made their way deeper into the graveyard. Then they found them. The 7 unmarked graves. They were arranged in a perfect circle. Unlike the rest of the cemetery, no moss or weeds grew on them. The dirt looked fresh, as if it had just been turned. Mark smirked. "All right, let's do this." He stepped onto one of the graves. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. Jess grabbed his arm. "Mark, don't." He rolled his eyes. "It's just a stupid legend." Chris laughed and stepped onto a grave too. "See? Nothing's happening." Jess stayed on the sidelines, shifting uncomfortably. The air felt wrong. The stillness was too deep, the silence too heavy. Then the air shifted. The night suddenly felt thicker, like something unseen was pressing against them. Chris's flashlight flickered. The ground beneath them trembled. Then, a whisper, low, right behind them. Jess spun around. "Did you hear that?" Mark's grin faltered. "It's just the wind." But there was no wind. Then Chris staggered back, his face pale. "Something touched me." Jess's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Chris shook his head, his breath coming fast. "Something grabbed my ankle." Mark scoffed. "Dude, stop messing around." But then the ground cracked right beneath Chris's feet. He gasped as the dirt sank, his foot disappearing into the soft earth. Jess screamed. Chris struggled, trying to pull himself free, but the ground was swallowing him whole. Jess lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "Hold on." Mark grabbed his other arm, pulling as hard as he could. Then Chris's flashlight hit the ground, and they saw it. Hands. Rotting, bony hands were reaching up from the earth, clawing at Chris's legs. Jess's blood turned to ice. Chris screamed. Mark let go and ran. Jess held on, pulling with everything she had. Chris's fingers dug into her wrists, his eyes wild with terror. "Don't let go," he sobbed. Then the whispers turned to laughter. Low, twisting, coming from everywhere at once. Jess looked down. Chris's lower body was gone. The ground had devoured him up to his chest. His eyes widened in horror. "Jess, please." Then, in one violent motion, the earth swallowed him whole. Jess screamed as Chris disappeared into the dirt. The ground went still, like nothing had happened. Jess fell back, shaking. No. Chris was gone. She turned toward Mark, but he was already at the gate, panting, his eyes wide with terror. She didn't think. She just ran. They didn't stop until they reached Mark's truck. They threw themselves inside, slamming the doors shut. Neither of them spoke. Then Jess gasped. "Mark?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Mark turned. Chris's flashlight was in the back seat. Neither of them had grabbed it. A cold chill slithered down Jess's spine. Drive. Now. Mark didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, peeling away from the cemetery. They never spoke about that night again. But the next morning, Chris's parents filed a missing person report. The police searched the entire cemetery. There was no sign of him. Not a single footprint, not even a disturbed grave. It was as if he had never been there. But Jess and Mark knew the truth. They had heard him scream. They had seen him vanish. And the worst part? A week later, Mark didn't show up to school. The police found his truck parked by Dawson Creek Cemetery. The driver's side door was open. The keys were still in the ignition. But Mark was gone. All that remained was his flashlight, left on, shining directly at one of the unmarked graves. Jess moved away a week later. She never told anyone what happened. But every night she heard whispers in her room, and every morning when she woke up, there was dirt on her sheets, like something had crawled into bed beside her, and waited.
Story number 8.
Mason Hollow Cemetery was not where you wanted to be after dark. That was the first thing old Henry told James when he took the job as the new gravekeeper. Lock the gates at sundown, Henry warned, his weathered face grim, and never, under any circumstances, answer when they call your name. James had laughed it off. Ghost stories were just that, stories. He was 26, broke, and desperate for work. A job watching over a cemetery? Easy money. He should have listened. The cemetery was old, too old. Most of the headstones were cracked, their names erased by time. A few leaned at unnatural angles, as if something beneath the dirt had shifted. James spent his first week raking leaves, fixing broken fences, and replacing candles left behind by mourners. It was peaceful during the day, almost beautiful. But at night, something changed. It started small. The air grew colder after sundown, too cold for summer. The shadows stretched too far, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Then came the whispers. They started just after midnight, soft, distant. They drifted through the cemetery like the wind, but there was no wind. James tried to ignore them, until one night they whispered his name. James, James. He froze, gripping his lantern tight. The voice was close. Too close. But when he turned, no one was there. He locked the gates and went straight to bed, heart pounding. The next morning, Henry was waiting for him. You heard them, didn't you? James hesitated. It was just my imagination. Henry shook his head. That's how it starts. James scoffed. What, you think ghosts are whispering my name? Henry's face darkened. Not ghosts. James frowned. Then what? Henry didn't answer. He just turned to leave. But before he left, he muttered, Don't answer them, no matter what you hear. The next night, James heard them again. James, help us. It wasn't just one voice now. It was many, men, women, children. Their voices overlapped, pleading. James, please, we're trapped. He shut his eyes. He wasn't going to fall for it. But then he heard his mother's voice. James, his breath caught. It sounded like her, the same gentle tone, the same warmth. His mother had died years ago. It wasn't possible. And yet, James, honey, please. His hands trembled. He knew he shouldn't. He knew. But then something knocked on his window. Slow, soft. His blood ran cold. He turned his head just enough to see the window. A shadow stood outside, tall, unmoving, watching. It had no face. James couldn't breathe. It knew he heard it. It was waiting for him to answer. He shut his eyes tight, pressing his hands over his ears. It's not real. It's not real. The whispers grew louder. The knocking turned to pounding. The floorboards creaked as something stepped inside. It was in the room with him. James clenched his jaw, willing himself not to look. The whispers surrounded him now, hundreds of voices pressing against his skull. Then silence. He opened his eyes. The room was empty. His window was shut. His breath came fast, uneven. It was gone. For now. James confronted Henry the next morning. What the hell is happening here? He demanded. Henry just stared at him. You answered them, didn't you? James hesitated. I didn't speak, he said. I just listened. Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. That's enough. James's stomach twisted. What are they? Henry's voice dropped to a whisper. They were buried wrong. James's throat went dry. What? Henry motioned for him to follow. They walked to the back of the cemetery, to the oldest part. The headstones here were crumbling, some completely blank. Henry pointed to a row of graves. No names, no dates, he said, because the town wanted to forget them. James frowned. Who were they? Henry's face was grim. People who were put in the ground alive. James's stomach dropped. That's insane, Henry sighed. It was a long time ago. Accusations of witchcraft, murder, didn't matter if they were guilty or not. They were buried anyway. But they never stayed quiet. James felt sick. He looked at the graves, his skin crawling. Then why hasn't anyone done anything? Henry laughed bitterly. You think the town doesn't know? They do. That's why they don't come here after dark. That's why they warn people like you. James clenched his fists. What happens if you answer them? Henry's expression darkened. They take you. James felt his pulse hammer in his skull. Then why am I still here? Henry turned, walking away. They're just waiting. That night, James barricaded his door. He wouldn't listen. He wouldn't answer. But at 3:13 a.m., the whispers started again. James. They were inside the room. He clenched his eyes shut. Then his mother's voice, soft, desperate. James, help me. His breath came in sharp gasps. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. Then the whispers turned to laughter, mocking, hungry. Something touched his shoulder. James screamed. The room went dark. The next morning, Henry knocked on the cabin door. No answer. He pushed it open. James was gone, but the window was wide open. Outside, the earth behind the cabin looked disturbed, as if something had been buried there overnight. Henry sighed, another one lost. He pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket, walked to the back of the cemetery, and added another mark to an empty headstone. Then he turned, locking the gates before sundown.
Story number 9.
The town of Ash Hollow had its share of ghost stories, but none were spoken about more fearfully than the well in the woods. It sat deep in the forest, forgotten and crumbling. A pit of darkness surrounded by twisted trees and damp earth. No one knew who built it or why, but everyone knew the rules. Never go near it, never look inside, and no matter what you hear, never speak to what's inside. Of course, teenagers never listen. That's how Ethan, Olivia, and Miles found themselves standing before the well one cold October night, their breath visible in the frigid air. It's just a hole in the ground, Ethan scoffed, kicking a loose rock into the darkness. They never heard it hit the bottom. Olivia shivered. We shouldn't be here. Miles grinned. What, scared the well monster's gonna get you? She glared at him. I heard things. People say a lot of crap, Ethan interrupted. He pulled a flashlight from his pocket and aimed it down. The beam barely touched the sides, swallowed almost instantly by the abyss. Then something whispered, low, wet, echoing up from the well's depths. Help me. Olivia stumbled back, her heart slamming against her ribs. Did you hear that? Miles hesitated. Probably just water dripping. Ethan smirked. Or maybe it's one of the dead kids. Olivia stiffened. There were stories, of course, of children who had fallen in, their bodies never recovered. Some said they still called out from the darkness, begging to be saved. Miles scoffed. Come on, man, don't mess with her. Ethan ignored him. What's wrong, Olivia? You don't want to help? She bit her lip. The whisper had sounded real. She took a step forward. Don't, Miles said, his voice tight. But Olivia was already leaning over the edge, peering into the void. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the endless black. Then a face appeared, pale, sunken, its mouth stretched too wide, its eyes nothing but dark, bottomless pits, and it was smiling at her. Olivia screamed, stumbling back. Ethan laughed. Damn, you should have seen your face. Then he stopped laughing, because the whisper came again. Help me, please. And this time it said his name, Ethan. The air turned thick, pressing in on them. The trees around the well seemed to lean closer, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers. Ethan's smirk faltered. I didn't say my name, he whispered. Miles grabbed his arm. We're leaving. Now! But Ethan wasn't listening. He took another step toward the well, his expression blank, his pupils too wide. Come closer. Miles grabbed his shoulder. Dude, we gotta go. But Ethan just smiled. I think I see someone down there. Then he climbed onto the edge. Ethan! Olivia screamed. But it was too late. Something shot up from the darkness. Long, rotting fingers that wrapped around his ankle and dragged him down. Ethan didn't even have time to scream. His body vanished into the black, swallowed whole. Silence. Then, thank you. Miles and Olivia ran. The town searched for Ethan for weeks. No sign of him was ever found. They checked the well, but it was empty. No body, no clothes, just bones at the bottom. Old bones. Too many to belong to just one person. Olivia stopped speaking after that night. Miles moved away before winter, but the whispers never stopped. And sometimes, when the wind was still, You could hear Ethan's voice calling from the well, begging, waiting for someone else to take his place.
Story number 10.
It started as a stupid school project. Mr. Langley, their history teacher, had assigned groups to research local folklore and find proof that it wasn't real. It was supposed to teach critical thinking, but Adam, Lucas, and Brianna weren't interested in logic. They wanted a thrill, and what better way than to investigate the 13th grave? Everyone in town knew the legend. In the oldest cemetery, Wilcox Rest, there was a row of 12 graves belonging to the McCaskill family, victims of an old fever epidemic. But legend said there was a 13th grave, a grave that only appeared at midnight, a grave that, if you stood over it too long, would open beneath you and pull you in. No one buried there had ever been found. It was just a story, but Adam wanted to prove it. The night of their experiment, the three of them snuck into Wilcox Rest just before midnight, flashlights in hand. Lucas laughed. "I don't see anything special." Brianna crossed her arms. "That's because it's just a myth." Adam smirked. "We'll see." They walked to the McCaskill family row. 12 graves, just like the stories said. They set up their cameras, waiting. The wind stilled. The air grew thick, heavy. Then the dirt moved. Lucas cursed. What was that? They all took a step back. The ground at the end of the row sank, slowly revealing an extra headstone. A 13th grave. Brianna's breath hitched. "No way." Adam grinned. "Told you." The name on the stone was eroded, unreadable. But the date was clear. 1887. Lucas shook his head. "Nope, we're done." But Adam wasn't listening. He stepped forward, standing directly over the grave. "What if I just—" Then the ground collapsed beneath him. Adam fell. Brianna screamed. Lucas lunged forward, but Adam was gone. The grave had sealed shut like it had never been open. Harsh. They ran. They told the police. Search parties scoured the cemetery. No one found a thing. No hole. No disturbed dirt. And worst of all, there were only 12 graves. No one believed them. But Brianna and Lucas knew what they had seen. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Adam's disappearance, Brianna got a text from Adam's number. "Come back." She dropped her phone. Then Lucas called her, his voice shaking. "Bri, go check the cemetery website." She did, and there it was. The official Wilcox Rest burial records. 13 McCaskill family members. The last one, Adam McCaskill. Born 2005, died 2023. And below it, buried in the family plot. Brianna's blood ran cold. She shut her laptop. She never went near Wilcox Rest again. But every year on the same night, she gets another text. "Come back." And every year there's a new 13th name in the records.